Howdy readers, I'm Jason, this is Chapter and Verse, and I have a guest with me today. If you guys have been following his channel or my wife's channel, you will know that Lukas from A Cruel Reader's Thesis has been staying with us this weekend. He is out here from Iowa. So he is going to be my guest today for a discussion of Stalker, the Andrei Tarkovsky film from the late 1970s. And I'll put a picture of Stalker up right here so you guys can see that. And then this is going to be part of my Page and Screen series. But this installment could actually be called a Screen and Page installment, because we're not actually going to be talking about the book, the novel that Stalker is based on, which is what I ordinarily do in these videos. But we're going to be talking about the film, and then we're going to be talking about the book Zona by Geoff Dyer, which is a kind of meditation on the film Stalker. So I just finished reading it this morning. Lukas finished reading it, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, maybe?
A week or so ago, yeah.
And so we're just going to kick this off with a discussion of the film. And so though, as far as there could be spoilers in Stalker, there will be spoilers discussed in this video. So if that bothers you, I would say shut it off, look for the film, watch the film, and then come back. And if it doesn't bother you, then continue watching. So the first thing I want to, the way I want to start this, I suppose, is I'm curious to know your history with the film. When you first saw it, how many times you've seen it, and yeah.
So, I'm a very recent cinephile. I just recently became a cinephile, like last year, or partially the year before that. And one of the first directors who I found out about as like an auteur, as like someone whose work I wanted to immerse myself in and work my way through every movie, was Andrei Tarkovsky, because he's quite famous, obviously, and he's very, very particularly popular in the film tube community, it seems. And so I encountered Stalker first when I was trying to watch all of Tarkovsky's films. Initially I tried to do it in the order in which they were released. I don't think I quite held to that, but Stalker I watched in the middle of that, so it was in a time where I was actually watching quite a bit of Tarkovsky films. And so, you know, I was probably 25 when I first watched it, and I remember thinking this was the most gripping Tarkovsky film that I've seen, and I still think it is his most like gripping film, even though when you look at the plot on paper it doesn't seem like it should be gripping. I think it is just incredibly gripping. But I remember thinking that primarily, and also just thinking that the movie was very sort of mysterious. I don't know, but so I saw it for the first time, and then the second time I watched it was a few weeks ago, when I watched it before reading this book. And then I watched it for a third time a couple of days ago after having read the book. So I've seen it 3 times, and I think watching it the third time was somewhat overkill, actually. I don't think I needed to, but I will say that it used to be my third favorite Tarkovsky film, after Andrei Rublev, my second favorite, and Mirror, my favorite, and it has now bumped out Andrei Rublev as my second favorite. So, yeah. So.
Yeah, Stalker, and so for myself, like Lukas, I've seen all of Tarkovsky's feature films. I haven't seen the documentary, right, that Dyer refers to multiple times through, was it Sculptures in Time or something like that?
That's his book,
That's his book, okay. But yeah, apparently he was involved in some way with the documentary.
Tempo di Viaggio.
Yeah, okay. And so yeah, I haven't seen that, but I have seen all the feature films, and Stalker is always jockeying back and forth between, or with Andrei Rublev and Nostalgia as my favorite of Tarkovsky's films, and much to Geoff Dyer's chagrin, I imagine, Nostalgia. But, you know, and I saw Stalker for the first time probably, I don't know, probably just over 20 years ago, I would say. And I think I've seen it 3 or 4 times now, most recently for this video. And so there was an 18-year gap between my most recent viewing of it and the next to most recent viewing of it. And like I told Lukas, when I finished watching it this most recent time, it was like it was like a completely different film for me. In part because of the film itself, right? And I was watching the Criterion Blu-ray, and so the film itself just looked brighter and sharper and cleaner and crisper than I had ever seen it look before. So it actually looked like a different film. But it was one of those strange things, right? Where as we get older, we change. And, we learn new things and we adopt new ideas, et cetera, et cetera. And because we're made into different people, when we revisit art from our youth, or, just in some cases, even from 1 or 2 years earlier, it just feels totally different because of the lenses that we're now looking at it through. And that was wild, and it was really intense for me this time around with Stalker. The last time I had seen it, I wasn't a religious person. And I have been a religious person for the last 15, 16 years. And looking at it now through that lens was wild. I mean, it was just completely wild and unexpected. And there was one section in the film where I was taking notes and I had to run it back, and I just decided I have to get down everything the characters are saying, because this is so powerful and important. And my wife was in the other room, and she was like, "What are you doing?" Because she would hear a snippet of Russian dialogue, and then there'd be silence. And then a snippet of Russian dialogue, and then there'd be silence. And I had to yell out that I was transcribing an entire conversation. But yeah, so what would be, I don't know, like, what are your kind of initial impressions of Stalker, right? I mean, if somebody was going to come to this film for the first time, what would you say to them as a way of convincing them to watch it?
Convincing someone to watch Stalker. Yeah. God, that's hard.
Sorry.
I feel like it's a movie that's kind of a bottomless pit, and one of the reasons that it is because it is very mysterious. Like, just because I think there's a lot of different ways you can interpret it. Like what the zone is or what it represents. There's a lot of different angles you could take with it, and I don't think anyone is necessarily mutually exclusive or invalid. But I guess. God, to missing someone to watch it, I guess I would just say it. I think it's getting at something really profound about religion and the different ways people approach faith, and the different ways people approach holy places, I guess.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so I don't know. So whoever I'm talking to would need to be a brainy person to find that an appealing pitch, I guess. But I guess I could say that again. I think it's his most gripping film. Like, it's one of his movies where I really do just lose track of time and don't tend to check how long it's been going on, how much longer I have of it. Whereas even in a great movie like Andrei Rublev, or certainly in something like Solaris, I'm frequently sort of like, okay, how much longer do I have of this? This is his most gripping film, even though it's probably not his most accessible. So I guess I would probably say something about how much there is to chew on in it, and and the fact that it's as gripping as it is. I don't know. That's a difficult question to answer on the whim.
No. I'm sorry. With respect to it being a gripping film, there's a part actually in Dyer's book that I didn't mark that I was going to mention there, but he talks about how Wim Wenders, I think it was Wim Wenders, the director of Wings of Desire, described Stalker as kind of the invention of suspense, right? Like a new kind of suspense in a film where every step could be, the character's last, right? And you're with them on this journey, and you don't know what's at the end of it. And he just talks about how it takes traditional suspense and I don't know, I guess makes it feel more personal, like there's more at stake, because we do feel like we're on this journey with them. Yeah, and I mean, and as we get closer and closer to the end of the film as well, it seems like there's more, even more at stake, and there's more cause for suspense when we find out what the professor's intentions are, et cetera, et cetera.
There's a bit of a switch at one point in the film, because I think for the first maybe 20% of the film, the suspense is from getting into the zone, because it's guarded by by the authorities, and it's guarded by the authorities. So there's this car chase scene, and I love that Dyer acknowledged that car chase makes no sense. Like that car chase makes no sense, and I don't think it's supposed to. It's just there as a car chase, but but it's there. So there the worry is, okay, we're gonna get caught by these guards, and then in the zone the worry is, at least ostensibly, the zone is supposedly really dangerous. He has to throw these pebbles to check that the path they're going on is safe, and he keeps saying like when they go through the tunnel, and he calls it, oh, this is the meat mincer. And it's like, oh, cool. And then there's a switch once they get very close to the room where the danger of the zone, the danger of any external danger is out, and it becomes more of an internal crisis, especially for the Stalker himself. Yeah. Because it ultimately becomes about Stalker just being disillusioned with the fact that these two men don't want their deepest desire, apparently. They came all this way and are just not going to do it, and one of them wants to destroy it, And so there's this switch right there from these external threats to an internal threat. And that, I think, is kind of the heart of the movie.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's, what you were saying about how it becomes a kind of crisis for Stalker himself. It made me think of that part near the end of Dyer's book where he talks about how we can see all of the emotions on Stalker's face at once. Like he seems to be, just in such torment, but it's torment that's also visited by joy and wonder and rapture and fear, et cetera, et cetera. It's just all of this stuff kind of coming out in him at the same time. And I mean, I think, again, right, I mean, like you said, it's gripping. It's one of the things that makes the film a really intense viewing experience. You are kind of on the edge of your seat with it, which is weird, right? I mean, because I think a lot of people would watch this and be like, nothing happens.
Well, I listened to a podcast episode, a podcast called Someone Else's Movie, where Agnieszka Holland, the Polish director, talked about Stalker, and the interviewer said that he watched Stalker in the movie theater, and he was with someone, and they said that they were bored during it. And he was just like, how are you bored? Every frame is so rich. And it really is.
Yeah, it's. I mean, even if you didn't get what was going on, it's a beautiful thing to look at. Yeah. And I think that's part of the problem with people. People who watch films, I think, is oftentimes they need there to be things happening. They need there to be a plot, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the wonderful things about cinema, for me, is how it just works on all those different levels, right? Whatever the story is, you're following the story, but you also have a part of your brain that is just really attuned to the framing and to the cinematography, and then a part of your brain that's attuned to the music. And the music in this is really, really odd, and I like that Dyer compares it at one point early in the book to a kind of Native American, like there's something kind of like a Native American kind of vibe to it, because I thought that as well early in the film, and I thought that was a strange choice initially, but then as the film goes on, right? I mean, there's references to Last of the Mohicans, and so it kind of makes me wonder. I don't know, and what was on Tarkovsky's mind as far as that goes. Yeah. But I think that would take a couple more views.
Yeah, I know. I didn't notice my first viewing that he calls that the writer, I think, keeps calling the Stalker. He keeps calling him Chingachuk, or the character from Last of the Mohicans. Yeah. Makes me really curious to read Last of the Mohicans now, because obviously the movie hadn't come out, so he wasn't referencing the movie Last of the Mohicans.
Well, he could have been referencing an old film. I mean, there were multiple versions, versions of Last of the Mohicans. But, Last of the Mohicans is a novel that I haven't read, and I've been wary of reading because my friend Ben has read it, and I think Ben considers it one of the worst books he's ever read, and he loves the film, and he thinks that the book is risible, like that it's laughably bad, which is kind of how I feel about Frankenstein, actually. So I can see it. But so one thing that's funny, when I was watching Stalker this time. So for those of you who haven't seen it, yeah. So I'll just say it begins in sepia, right? In a kind of sepia tone, and then when the travelers get to the zone, there's a transition into color. And then there are actually transitions back to sepia within the zone, which I'm not sure I fully understand. That's one of the mysteries of the movie. And then when they return at the end back to the real world, it's sepia again. But then it transitions into color in the real world. So it kind of jostles back and forth between these. But one of the things that I thought about watching it this time, and I really hoped, because I had never heard of this before, and it had never occurred to me before, maybe because I was just really obtuse when I was young. But when I watched it this time, I was just thinking about the Wizard of Oz through the whole thing, and I had never done that before, and I was really hoped that Dyer wouldn't mention that. I was hoping that this was an original thing of mine, but not only does Dyer mention it in the book, he says that it has been widely discussed over the years, and I had just never seen it discussed over the years. But I love that. I love these parallels with the Wizard of Oz, and it's not just the sepia and color changes, right? It's the idea of there being two worlds, right? Kansas and Oz. It's the idea of the characters in both films. It's more explicit in the Wizard of Oz, but they're after their deepest desire, right? I mean, they're looking for the one thing that will complete them, essentially, right? In the Wizard of Oz, it's a brain, it's a heart, it's courage. And in this, I mean, we never really quite know what it is for the characters.
Yeah, there's no reveal moment where you see that there's actually just a person behind the gigantic face, right?
Yeah.
But that was another thing that I appreciated in Dyer, was that he kept making these comparisons to sort of genre conventions. Like he at one point says that the three men meeting in the bar seem like they could be meeting up to plan a heist. It could be a heist movie.
Yeah.
And he also, I think, suggests that bar almost looks like a saloon in a western, and so it could be like and you could think of Stalker as like an outlaw, right? So it's like a western. And another thing that's interesting with the western connection, actually, to me, is that Tarkovsky was a big fan of Sergio Leone's work, and apparently I don't know about Stalker, but while he was actually making Mirror, he had several films that he wanted everyone on the set to watch, and I think 4 of them were spaghetti westerns by Sergio Leone.
Really?
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
But I just liked all of these, and then there's the car chase too, which is it's funny because I remember my mom, when I was younger, she would always say, "Oh, in every great American movie, there's a car chase," and so it was just funny. I'd never thought of the car chase as just a car chase in which action movies also tend not to make much sense, and it doesn't make any sense here either.
Yeah. Yeah, speaking of Tarkovsky's, you bring up his love of Sergio Leone, and so one of the things about Tarkovsky, I have a book of interviews with him over there. I should have grabbed it before we started making the video. Tarkovsky was a snob, to put it kind of kindly, I suppose. And it makes me wonder, I mean, I'd like to go back and look through those interviews and see if he ever talks about The Wizard of Oz, actually. Because it doesn't seem like a film, I suppose, that Tarkovsky would be fond of. But the parallels are really strong and really striking, and I feel like he must have had it in mind. But yeah, I mean, he was just so snooty. In one of those interviews in that book, the journalist interviewing him, I don't remember what the context was, but brings up Spielberg and Tarkovsky's film sort of in relation to what Spielberg was doing, and the journalist made some kind of connection or whatever, and Tarkovsky was so offended. He was, just vocally offended in the interview that you know, that the writer, that the journalist would have the audacity to bring up Steven Spielberg in relation to Tarkovsky's own work. And I just remember reading that, you know, this was like 18, 20 years ago when I read it. And I just remember thinking, God, what an ass, man. I mean, I love his movies, but what an ass.
Yeah, he sounds like he was a bit of a jerk.
Yeah. Yeah, and Dyer says that at one point, right? That it was almost like Tarkovsky had reached a point near the end of his career where he was kind of worshiping himself, and which is not a healthy thing to do. Yeah, that's probably not terribly uncommon. But it is weird to think of somebody who is that much of an outlier from the kind of celebrity world of filmmaking, even back then, right? To fall victim to this kind of self-worship sort of thing, because I mean, it seemed to be a thing that he really disdained in the world of Hollywood filmmaking, and yet he himself kind of succumbed to it in some ways, which is it's ironic and maybe a little tragic.
Yeah.
But yeah. All right, let me see. What else have we got to talk about here? All right, so one thing I wanted to talk about, and this is going to kind of fold the book in really quick. And so a few years ago, right after Svetlana Alexievich won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I read her book, Voices from Chernobyl. And have you read this?
No, I read her other book, Secondhand Time.
Gotcha.
I really love that book.
Yeah, I have that over there, and I think I bought that after seeing Neil Griffiths recommend that.
Yeah, me too.
in a video. But reading Voices from Chernobyl, right? It's the oral history of a nuclear disaster. And so what she does in this, and I think what she does in all of her work really, is she collects just dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of interviews of people who have lived through a particular event. In this case, right, the meltdown of Chernobyl, that nuclear reactor. And then she kind of makes a collage of their interviews. And when I read this, you know, I was already a big fan of Stalker, even though I hadn't seen it in a long time. And I was really, really struck by the fact that so many of the survivors of this event in this book refer to the area around the place that has been sort of made radioactive, et cetera, by the fallout. They refer to it as the zone, with a capital Z. And, you know, and one of the things that Dyer does in this book is talks about how Stalker feels prescient in a lot of ways. And when you watch the film now, when they first get into the zone, you know, they remark on how quiet it is, right? And everything feels kind of desolate and alien, even though it's their world, it's their landscape. It's been changed somehow. And, you know, and that film was made, I mean, when was the Chernobyl meltdown? It was like in the mid-'80s, I think. Yeah. It was like 86 or 85, something like that. And so the film was made, you know, 6-7 years before that happened. And it feels, watching it, it feels like a movie about these men kind of, you know, venturing into this forbidden world.
Yeah, it's like what you were saying there reminded me of you'll forgive me, a Freudian term, the uncanny, like when something that is familiar is made to seem unfamiliar, you know? And, you know, like, you can look at, like, the easy example for me right now is the Hitchcock film, The Birds, because I just watched it. But, like, birds, we usually look at them as either benign or just sort of, or pretty. But then the birds takes them and makes them dangerous and mysterious, you know? And, like it's not like, the Chernobyl disaster and Stalker, the film, make what would otherwise be a pretty mundane landscape into something really weird and unsettling.
Yeah.
You know?
You know, another film that does that, you know, this idea of the uncanny that you're talking about is Jacob's Ladder. Have you seen Jacob's Ladder? The original? Directed by Adrian Lyne. And there are... So it's about a Vietnam vet, and he, you know, returns home from the war, and he's working as a postal worker, and he, you know, has an apartment and a girlfriend, et cetera, and there are just these these changes to his apartment, right? And he's just always kind of wrong-footed. Like he comes home in the middle of the night and he stubs his toe, and he asks his girlfriend, like, "Did you move the table or did you move the chair or whatever?" And then there are moments in the film where he thinks she's a demon. You know, I mean, this woman that he spends every day with and sleeps with, etc., etc. And there's moments where she just seems like she's other than herself, and yeah, you know, and so it's like he can't escape. He can't escape from it, right? Because this is his ordinary world. This is the place to which he would retreat from something like that, ideally. But because it's within his own environment, in his own everyday existence, there's no place to retreat. And that in itself, I think, is a terrifying idea.
Yeah. Something that, so something that I find really kind of hilarious about Stalker on a meta level is so you have this guard, the whatever state it takes place in, it's not supposed to be the Soviet Union, even though it looks a lot like the Soviet Union, but there's a guard around the zone, right? Like you're not supposed, the government doesn't want you to get in, so to get into the zone they have to sneak in, and there's a whole car chase sequence. And what I thought was funny is that the censors in the Soviet Union wanted Tarkovsky to make sure that people watching the movie wouldn't associate that government with the Soviet. They wanted it to be some other bourgeois government. And I thought that was just... because there's something so, impotent about being terrified to go into a place, but then also forbidding anyone else from going, you know, because that's basically what the government is doing, because they did send in people who never returned, and so they're terrified to go in, but they also don't want anyone else to go in. And there's something just, it's almost like a joke on them, I don't know, it's just like it's sort of, but it's impotent, there's this impotence to that. But also, the thing that I find hilarious about the fact that the censors wanted Tarkovsky to make sure that no one associated that government with the Soviet government, is that totally sounds like something the Soviet government would do, you know what I mean? So I think it was while reading the book where I just laughed out loud at that, the fact that they were like the punchline to a joke that they didn't even know they were a part of, you know?
Yeah. What you just brought up, the idea of so the government sent people in who didn't return, and yet the Stalker takes people in and then clearly leaves people out, and and thinking about the tension between those two things, while watching the film and reading about it in Zona, it made me wonder. I mean, how much of that has people successfully coming out? How much of that has to do with their intent? Like how pure it makes. It reminds me of. I'm thinking right now of the end of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, right, where they go in. And like only the pure of heart, right? I mean, the people who are not interested in the cup for the sake of greed can leave, can pass the seal, and so maybe the seal, maybe that cave there at it was Petra or something, is kind of like the zone in that way, right? That the people who go in with wrong intent in their heart are the people who are going to drink from a cup and turn into a horrifying skeleton in the space of 30 seconds and then blow up. And then the people who are pure of heart, who have good intentions, will be able to survive it.
Well, that's what Stalker at least claims, that, or maybe he's only referring to other stalkers, but you can't, if you go to the room with that intent or with selfish intent or ulterior motives, I think is the words he uses, then, well, I guess he doesn't really say what happens to you, but apparently something bad. But like then, that leads nicely into talking about the story about Porcupine, who he claims the Porcupine was another stalker who taught Stalker, who supposedly came to the room with ulterior motives, and that's what led to his suicide. But really what led to his suicide was that his brother had just died, and so he went to the room hoping to find his deepest desire, and he thought that his deepest desire was to have his brother back, but it turned out that his deepest desire was to be rich. So he went to the room, got super wealthy, and then realized that he was deep down a horrible person, and then committed suicide, And I guess now, thinking back on the first question you asked about how I would sell the film, I forgot to talk about that is one of the most interesting aspects of the story, is this idea that, like, there's a great, I think, spiel that I think Ryder gives about how, yes, my mind tells me that I want to be a vegetarian, but deep down I really want to eat steak all day, you know, and the idea that we can't actually know our deepest desires, like, and like Geoff Dyer has a bit of a weird passage where where he talks about what he thinks his deepest desire is, and apparently it's to have a threesome, and apparently he thinks that most middle-aged men dream about having a threesome at some point.
Yeah, that it's their deepest desire as well.
Yeah, and
which I think is it's a way of him to feel better about that being his, maybe. To assign it to everyone else too.
Yeah, and but the idea that the deepest desire that you would get in the room is not actually something you would want revealed, you know. Like when I try to think of what I would get if I went to the room in that case, it's definitely not something I would talk about in a YouTube video. You know.
Yeah. Whereas I think, and I told you this the other day. Whereas I think, I don't know for sure if it's my deepest desire, but I mean, if pressed to answer that question, I would say that I would like to be independently wealthy, not in order to be rich, but in order to free myself up so that I have time. So I guess it wouldn't be independently wealthy. It would be that I want time. I want the 8 hours a day where I'm at work to do other things, to read and to hang out with my cat and to go on walks with my wife and
right.
So maybe that's what it would. Maybe that's what it would be. Maybe the problem with Porcupine is that he really was just like Scrooge McDuck, man. He just wanted all the money.
Mm-hmm.
He just wanted the money, and he didn't want to do maybe necessarily anything good with it for himself or for others.
Yeah.
I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah, but he clearly didn't think that of himself.
No,
which is what's so interesting about it.
And I think anybody who feels that way isn't going to want to admit that about themselves.
Yeah, and I think. That's why Ryder and Professor ultimately don't want to go into the room. They just realize that they don't want to deal with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just occurred to me that when I talked about Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, that I was drawing a parallel between Spielberg and Tarkovsky.
Oh, Tarkovsky is turning in his grave.
Turning over in his grave, which is funny.
Something that I wanted to bring up that I think is interesting.
Yeah.
Is that it seems to me that Stalker, Professor, Ryder all kind of represent the sort of three kind of pillars of civilization in a way. Like, because I look at Stalker as like a priest, and Ryder is not just a writer. I think he's also a stand-in for just artists, musicians, philosophers, the humanities, basically. And then the professor is the scientist. And so there are these three sort of pillars, I think, of civilization. The way that we gain knowledge would be the scientist, and then humanities is sort of the study of humanity, and then the priest who is wrapped up in religion. And I just think it's an interesting way to just explore the essence of being human with having these three stand-ins for these three aspects of civilization that have been important. But the other thing that I really wanted to get to was it seems like the Stalker is sort of creating his own religion in a way out of the zone. And he's the priest of it, right? Because he knows everything about the zone. He knows how to get through the zone. He builds up this mystery around the zone, and there's like this holy place, right? The room is like it's like, I don't know, the Dome of the Rock or something, whatever.
The holiest of holies.
Yeah, something like that. And so he's created his own religion out of this place, and so when he sees that people don't want what he's offering, it's this huge crisis for him. And so what I think is interesting is you're sort of seeing the process of the creation of a religion in sort of microcosm. You know?
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree, and it's why I find it funny that Geoff Dyer talks about how Tarkovsky didn't like symbolic interpretations of his films, right? Tarkovsky would say the zone is the zone, right? And no, Tarkovsky, you really don't want us to think the zone is just the zone, right? Otherwise, your dialogue would be less philosophical and more like, "Oh, I'm going to go to the store and I'm going to pick up some donuts. Do you need anything?" Right? And his dialogue is not like that. So that scene when they arrive at the room, right? They're on the cusp of the room, and they have this this kind of tussle between them. There is so much in that is so complicated and rich along the lines of what you're talking about. This idea of the creation of a religion, right? And the Stalker being the kind of priest figure of the religion. And, so I just wanted, this is that conversation that I transcribed from the subtitles. It says, in the struggle over the bomb, the Stalker says, there's nothing else left to people on Earth. This is the only place to come to when all hope is gone. You have to come here. Then why destroy hope? To which the writer replies, shut up. I see through you. You don't give a damn about others. You earn your money from our misery. It's not even the money. You enjoy this. Here you're czar and God. You louse. You decide who's to die and who's to live. He chooses. He decides. I know why the Stalker himself never enters the room. What for? You're drunk with power out here, with mystery, with authority. And I think people who are who feel hostile toward religion would, this would be, many of their own kind of complaints about it, right? Like, this idea of you decide who gets into heaven and who's left out, etc., etc. This resentment about that, and it was incredibly powerful. And then there's another line, and I think this is Stalker saying this. He says, what comes true here is the essence of your nature, which made me think. I said, how true is that of religion? The selfish and hateful and warmongering people use religion to justify their behavior, whereas the gracious and loving find their impulses clarified, amplified, and directed by religion. And so yeah, that made me, I don't know, that line probably more than anything else was the thing that made me really feel like the zone was the kind of the core or the crux of a new way of thinking about the soul and the spirit and whatnot, and I just think it's incredibly powerful, And if you look at the threes, you talk about writer, professor, and Stalker, kind of symbolizing the kind of the quadrants of society. The idea of the three is just fascinating, right? Because of the Trinity and the crucifixion, right, with the thieves and Christ, and at the end of the film, Stalker's daughter is moving 3 glasses on the table, and it's fascinating. So the end of the film was my favorite scene in the film, and I was disappointed that Dyer didn't kind of dig into it more than he does.
I know it just in terms of the book as a book, I was disappointed with how it just kind of petered out. It was like, okay, last scene, bye.
Yeah, and so he talks about. So as I was reading the end of the book, for the first time, I was thinking of the glasses, and maybe I'm reaching here or whatever, but I do really feel like it's a film that invites a lot in the way of interpretation. Yeah. But reading the end of Dyer's book was the first time that I started thinking of those 3 glasses as something more than just 3 glasses. And if we think of them as kind of stand-ins for the middle glass as a stand-in for her father, or a stand-in for Christ as head of the church, and the other 2 glasses is the thieves and the crucifixion. When Dyer says, he talks about Kenzaburo Oe, I can't remember.
Oh, a short story, right?
Yeah, if I'm pronouncing his name right. He talks about how the glass shatters and blah blah blah. And Dyer says, well, actually, it doesn't. That's the thing. And I love this idea, right? So if the middle glass is her father or is Christ, and it goes off the end of the table, instead of breaking or being broken by what's happening, it remains solid, right? It's unbreakable, etc., etc. So I find that super interesting. Really incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, and just the whole character of Monkey as well. We've talked a little bit about Monkey, and one of the so there are two things that I really really love about the character of Monkey, right? So at the beginning, and again, I never noticed this when I saw the film in the past. As much as I love the ending of the film when she moves these glasses with her mind, the first time we see the family, we see a little table next to a bed, and a train is going by outside, and the vibration from the train moves the glass on the table across the table.
I noticed that this time.
And then we pan across the family who are all sleeping, right? So. And then it goes back as well, and so then at the end of the film, when she's doing the moving of the glasses, it's just this idea, right, of a human being containing all of this power, and having it at her disposal, right? That she is the one who can channel it, and I just thought that was just an extraordinary way to bookend the film. And then also when they leave, when Stalker gets back at the end and him and his family leave the pub, as it were, this seedy, apocalyptic watering hole, we see it. She appears to be walking.
But she has crutches.
Well, yeah, she has crutches. Well, she appears to be walking. And,
right,
and there's an illusion, and she's on her father's shoulders, right? The camera eventually comes down. And I love that Tarkovsky is... this whole idea, like if we think of Stalker as a kind of Christ-like figure, right, the head of this church, and the way in which in the Gospels, right, I mean, he makes the lame walk, right, he performs these miracles, he cures these people, and just that Tarkovsky is doing this thing with his camera that presents us the illusion of this girl who's crippled and can't walk, walking, and then we see that she's actually being carried by this figure, by her father. There's just something really, really incredibly powerful about it and mysterious about it. And I think it feeds into this kind of religious view of it. And it's something that, because I wasn't a religious man myself in the past, it never really occurred to me, and I think in the past I loved the ending so much because of Beethoven's Ode to Joy, right? Like I really, really love the Ninth Symphony. It's probably my favorite piece of music. And so the incorporation of that, and but now it's so much more than that.
That's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. I do think that I did notice that shot, and I thought that was a really cool shot of like where you think Monkey's walking and you don't, but I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah.
But I mean, the way that the direction I sort of thought you were going when you were talking, and then you went in a different direction, was, Monkey seems to have been imbued with some kind of, all this power, right? Through means that no one really understands, even the Stalker.
Yeah, like a child of the zone or something.
Yeah, and so, I mean, in a way, you could see her as like the young Jesus or something, who, like when Mary and Joseph found Jesus having these complex conversations with the rabbis in the temple or something when he was like 10,
mm-hmm.
or whatever. You could see her as someone like that. We don't get to see where she goes from there. I'm really interested in Monkey's future, basically, like what's she going to do, and I'm also just sort of logistically intrigued because like she has crutches. We see that she has crutches, but she can stand because we see her standing next to her mom. Her mom picks her up and puts her on a bench to sit. So I'm just intrigued by what her physical disability really is. But anyway, but yeah, that's cool. Yeah, but it's interesting the way you mentioned the music briefly earlier. I think the soundtrack of this is really cool. Something that I learned in an interview with the composer Edward Artemiev. I was on the Criterion edition of Mirror, but he talks about Stalker and he talks about Solaris too. He actually wrote another piece that never made it into the film, and it was supposed to be this sort of eerie piece of music that plays while they're walking through the meat mincer, through that tunnel, which in the form that we have has no soundtrack, I don't think.
Yeah, it's just the ambient sound of the water.
Water and apparently that piece of music was released, so I feel like I want to listen to it. But I find it interesting the way that Tarkovsky uses the three pieces of classical music that he uses in this movie, because he uses them in a way that most films don't use classical. Most films, when they use classical music, will use it for a sort of symphonic, you know, swelling of whatever is going on. You know, like in the Tree of Life. Oh my God, I'm talking about Terrence Malick.
No, it's fine, man.
This
is a Malick safe space.
In the Tree of Life, when the piece of music by Bedřich Smetana starts to play, yeah, you know the scene where Jessica Chastain's character is holding the baby and spins around and points to the sun, and that's where God lives. That piece of music, you know, it's this symphonic, like, montage, whatever. That's how you typically think of movies using pieces of classical music, I think. But here he uses them in Stalker. Tarkovsky uses them so transiently. You know, I mean, we hear like 10 seconds of Ravel's Bolero, right? We hear like 5 seconds of the Ode to Joy, and there's also a piece of music that plays near the beginning when Stalker's wife is like spazzing out on the ground, and I actually don't know what piece of music that is. I think when I first watched the movie, I thought it was from Wagner's Tannhäuser, but I don't. Do you know what piece of music?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't off the top of my head.
Yeah, but I think it's just interesting the way that he chooses to use so little of them.
Well, and not only so little of them, but in particular with Ode to Joy, and maybe Bolero as well. But with Ode to Joy, it almost, the way it's laid in with the sound, with the of the train, it sounds like it's part of the sound of the train, and what he's doing with that. I mean, what that says, right? You know, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's so many things. There's so many directions you could go. You know, if you think about the lyrics of Ode to Joy, and about how it's about brotherhood, and it's about, you know, union and reunion, and people coming together, and trains are on tracks that connect places, etc., etc. I mean, who knows what all he was doing? And we talked about this. Artists aren't even always aware of what they're doing. Oftentimes, there's just unconscious things happening in their decision making, and but he does use classical in a very interesting way. It's much more dramatic. The use of Ode to Joy and Nostalgia is much more dramatic than it is in Stalker.
I need to rewatch Nostalgia because I didn't remember that he uses the Ode to Joy in that.
You don't remember that? It's during the self-immolation at the end.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes sense. Yeah. So the film that I kept comparing it to in that regard was Mirror. Because he uses a lot. He uses several different pieces of music, and I actually don't think one of them is the Beethoven's Ninth. Actually, he uses music in that one in a very different. He uses it in the more conventional way that I was talking about. You know, like near the end of Mirror, you have the opening from the St. John Passion by Bach, and it's used in this very. But it's funny because it's used on top of a scene that doesn't seem all that dramatic, right? Mm-hmm. And it's this very dramatic music about, you know, the crucifixion of Christ, and you know, but he also uses some odd music. Like there's this scene in Mirror where you just see a young boy and a young girl, brother and sister, hugging their father who's just come home after a long time, and then suddenly you hear this like opera aria, and it's this like Baroque music, and it just seems. When I first watched it, I was like, this is really jarring and weird, and you know, but for some reason it works for me now, and I don't know, he had an interesting way of using classical music, different from others. Yeah,
well, and I think you know, of all filmmakers that I can think of, you're probably aware of more, because you're such a fan of classical music and really kind of study it in a way that I never have. But I think Tarkovsky and Terrence Malick are the two who, I mean, they just seem to have this kind of encyclopedic knowledge of it, and they have really, really good instincts of what to use where. You know, that scene that you brought up from the Tree of Life, I mean, as soon as you started talking, I knew exactly what scene it was. I knew what you were talking about. And that's the scene in the film that when Kelly and I saw it in the theater, I just fucking burst into tears. I burst into tears at that moment. And it was just a perfect fusion of music, image, dialogue. It was just, it's like a perfect moment in a reasonably perfect film. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the book. About Geoff Dyer, right? So
he's an interesting writer.
he's an interesting person. He's somebody who I'm not sure I would get along with in real life. And so one of the interesting things is, and which I mentioned to you the other day, is on the Criterion Blu-ray, there's an interview with Geoff Dyer about Stalker. And in the interview, he seems really nice. He seems really smart and you know, kind and funny and, you know, personable. And he seems like such a pompous ass in so much of this book that I'm not sure how well I would get along with him in real life, I suppose. But
yeah, because like Jason and I talked about it or sometime where I was like, I sympathize a little bit more with Geoff Dyer's taste than his taste in film, his general taste, than I suspect Jason would, because I'm a bit more of the sort of art house foreign film kind of cinephile. But I like to think I'm not a snob about it. That's sort of what I find most interesting.
But what's interesting is that he is that as well, right? Which is why you came to that conclusion. But at the same time, he spends a fair amount of this book dragging a lot of mostly really good art films through the mud. And
like Laventura, the Antonioni film.
Yeah, you know, and occasionally it's funny, like all that shit about Laventura, about how he entered the cinema, right? So in the film, there are no seconds, hours, etc., etc. Like, it takes so long that he entered the film in his 20s, and he left the cinema in his 30s, which I thought was really hilarious, even though I love Laventura. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so he rakes Laventura over the coals, and Ulysses Gaze, and The Double Life of Veronique. What's that?
Breathless, which
I
don't exactly love Breathless, but it's like a classic movie. Yeah.
And he just has the harshest things to say about some of these films, and even some of Tarkovsky's films. Like, he hates Nostalgia. He hates The Sacrifice.
He hasn't seen The Sacrifice.
Yeah,
he disliked nostalgia so much that he refuses to watch The Sacrifice.
Yeah, and
which I guess, again, I'm slightly more sympathetic, because The Sacrifice is actually my least favorite Tarkovsky film. But yeah.
It's just weird to me, because in particular, thinking about Michelangelo Antonioni, who made Laventura, and Theo Angelopoulos, who made Ulysses Gaze, these are directors whose sensibilities, whose understandings, whose senses of how to use time in film, and how to use and how to frame shots, etc., etc. It's all very Tarkovskian. Like, those three filmmakers. If somebody asked me what two filmmakers would you feel like, you know, are stylistically, you know, kind of kindred spirits with Andrei Tarkovsky, I would say Angelopoulos and Antonioni. And for some reason, Geoff Dyer hates the work of those filmmakers and loves the work of Tarkovsky. Now, I'm sure he's smarter than I am, right? I'm sure he is. I'm not saying that. But yeah, I mean, I haven't seen a ton of Antonioni. I've seen a couple of his films. But I've seen probably half, or maybe even slightly more than half of Angelopoulos' films, including a lot of stuff that has never been released in America. And some of it, I don't think was even released in theaters in America. And I was able to see those films at a time when, so what I did was I got in touch with, so there's a professor in the Midwest, I think in Oklahoma, who's an Angelopoulos expert. And I think he put me in touch with the woman who translates, or translated, I should say, Angelopoulos' films. Her name is Ellie Petrides, and in Athens. And she essentially loaned me, they were PAL VHS copies of Voyage to Cythera, The Beekeeper, and The Suspended Step of the Stork. None of these films had ever been released for audiences, you know, home video or whatever in America. And she mailed them to me from Greece, and I had to drive to Laramie, and on a weekend, and my old German professor had to actually set up the foreign languages department screening room for me, because they were PAL copies, and you know, and that was the only place that had a PAL VCR, because they had all of these videos that they would show students in foreign languages. And so, so one day I drove to Laramie, and I sat in a dark room, and I watched 3 Angelopoulos films in one day, which I mean, it would probably kill Geoff Dyer. I mean, he probably would have died, actually, from that.
Might kill me too. I mean,
it's pretty intense. Yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty intense. But yeah, two of them are masterpieces. You know, and The Beekeeper is the only film of his I've seen that I don't really like. But every other film from Angelopoulos I've seen, I give a 10 out of 10. So I don't know. So that was one thing about Zona that just kind of rubbed me the wrong way, is that he too often in the book seems like he's trying to seem really kind of cool and smart and sophisticated, instead of and part of it, I mean, backfires. You know, one of the things which I mentioned to you the other day, one of the things that really drove me crazy in the book is when he brings up the Wizard of Oz. And how, you know, much has been made in the past about the connections between Stalker and the Wizard of Oz. And he says in a footnote, and the footnotes in this are fucking long, by the way. Some of them are pages long. Yeah. But he says in a footnote that in an earlier draft of this book, he had mentioned that he had never seen the Wizard of Oz and had no desire to. And then he goes on to say that he has since seen it and regrets having thought that. And I told Lukas, I said, why did he include that in the first place? It does nothing at all but make him seem like a pompous ass.
Well, I mean, you could see it another way. I mean, I guess I saw it slightly differently. I actually saw I saw that as him being a little bit self-aware, I'll say, not self-conscious, self-aware. Because clearly he realized he was wrong, right? And, you know, there's a suggestion in that maybe his taste isn't always the best. You know, if he poo-pooed the Wizard of Oz, you know, and so I actually saw that as a sort of self-aware moment where I was like, okay, so like maybe Geoff Dyer realizes he's a bit of a pompous ass, and maybe he's like doing all this to slightly make fun of himself. I don't know.
Well, it's possible, yeah, but I mean, it's a tricky thing. It's a tricky thing to pass judgment on a classic film without having seen it.
Yeah.
You know, there's something. It's one thing to watch it and be like, oh, that's overrated, that's no good, or whatever. But to say I haven't seen this and I'm proud of not having seen this and I have no intention of ever seeing this. There's something so sniffy about that.
Yeah.
And it just drove me bonkers.
Yeah.
That he would do these things in this book that would kind of take me out of it a little bit. You know.
Yeah, but he clearly has really good, interesting taste. He names some of films I've never heard of that sound really interesting, you know. I mean, I think he goes on at some length about one particular Russian director who was very Tarkovskyan, but sounds like he made really good movies, and I can't remember the name of the director. He names, I think, a Turkish film that has an extended scene. He describes this really, what sounds like a really great scene where someone is watching Stalker with their friend, and their friend gets really bored and goes upstairs, and so he puts on pornography.
Yeah.
So he clearly has really interesting taste to me. Yeah, the thing that probably I have the most reservations about with the book is some of the footnotes that in some of the footnotes he'll go off on basically just a tangent, a complete tangent. You know, like at one point he talks about he goes on this whole discussion about how his wife looks like a famous actress. Is it the actress who plays Stalker's wife?
No, she's in Solaris.
Okay,
she's in the Soderbergh version of Solaris.
Yeah, and he goes on and on about it, and he talks about how, you know, it was brought up at a dinner party or something, and how, but then they aged, and now that they don't look so. I'm just like, I don't care. You know? I do not care if your wife looks like whoever the actress was in Solaris. You know, and there were a few points like that got to me where I was like, right, get over yourself, let's go, you know?
Yeah, he does tend to slide further down certain rabbit holes than benefits the book, you know? I mean, there were some digressions that he would go off on with these footnotes, and I would lose track of what the fuck he was talking about in the first place in the book, you know? And I'd have to go back and kind of reread a paragraph to reorient myself, because the footnote took me as a reader so far away from what he was actually doing. And as annoying as that can be, I did find this, partly because of that, I found this a really stimulating read. You know, on the back here, there's one critic actually refers to it as stimulating. But where is that? Yeah, The Atlantic says an engaging piece of writing that asks questions about the nature of art and provides a new way to write about film. And I think that's really, really accurate. This feels like a completely original way of approaching thinking about cinema and thinking about your own personal relationship to it. And as I've told Lukas a couple of times over the last couple of days, I find myself wanting to write a book about the Thin Red Line in much the same kind of style as this book.
Yep.
Where you're not just explicating the film, you're not just breaking down the film, but you're also allowing yourself to go down rabbit holes that are more personal.
Yeah. Well, what I liked about the book, and what I also found unexpected, I wasn't expecting it to be like basically a summary of Stalker. That's basically what it is. Yeah. Basically, he just goes through the movie scene by scene, almost moment by moment, and just kind of describes what's happening and offers comments, observations. Yeah, and that wasn't what I was expecting it to be. I was actually expecting it to be a bit more like an extended interpretive essay of the themes. And it was cool because it was like rewatching Stalker without having to rewatch Stalker, which is why I felt like watching Stalker a third time after reading the book was a little bit superfluous. But yeah, I find the idea of just sitting and watching a movie and working through every moment, every scene, and working through what I think and making those little observations. I love that part of it especially. I like that idea too, and no, I enjoyed the heck out of it for that reason. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, when you put it the way that you just did, it made me think of, in a way that the book itself didn't actually make me think of. Made me think of the fact that Roger Ebert, the late film critic Roger Ebert, used to have these seminars that last like a day-long thing, and they would go, like he and another, like a professor of film studies or something, they would have a crowd there, and they would go through, they would take Psycho, or they would take Citizen Kane. I know that they did it with Citizen Kane, I think they did it with Psycho. And they would actually go through and analyze the film frame by frame. They would go through it frame by frame and talk about what was going on. And I used to think, man, I would love to be a fly on the wall. Or maybe I wouldn't actually. Maybe I would get to the end of things like, oh my God, we're only 30 minutes into the movie. We've been talking about this for 8 hours. This is horrible. Yeah. I mean, maybe I would feel like that. But that's one of the things, right? That's one of the things about great art. Whether we're talking about Stalker or Citizen Kane or Psycho or Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. One of the things about great art is that it allows for a kind of inexhaustible interpretation. You know, I've said before in some of my ShakeTube videos in the past, they talk about how Ron Rosenbaum, who wrote the Shakespeare Wars, has this relationship with A Midsummer Night's Dream, and he feels like A Midsummer Night's Dream is inexhaustible, right? That it's literally a bottomless play, and he actually, I mean, looks at the whole body of work of Shakespeare as that you could spend your lifetime reading it, rereading it, and studying it, and thinking about it, and you would constantly arrive at new ideas and new interpretations of it. And for anyone to create a work of art that's capable of that is kind of astonishing, And I think part of, and I wouldn't necessarily say Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is one of those, although I think Spielberg has created art that is much more kind of in line with that. But part of it is the fact that, that we don't have dialogue like, oh, I'm going to the corner market and get some donuts, Instead we have dialogue that opens up a field of interpretation instead of closing it down. And God, man, I just love art like that. Yeah. Whether it's Bergman or, we think of literature. For me, writers like Dickens, and
Samuel Beckett.
Yeah, Samuel Beckett for you. Yeah. So anyhow.
But it's funny that you talk about the dialogue, because actually that interview with Agnieszka Holland, at one point she says that often while watching Stalker she feels compelled to turn the subtitles off because she actually finds the dialogue bothersome sometimes. Oh, and she was like, she was like, in her Polish accent, like, this is my one reservation, that I do not like the dialogue.
Well, and I think a lot of people, critics, including Roger Ebert, who hated Ulysses Gaze. Geoff Dyer probably loved Ebert's review of it. He gave it 1 star. A lot of people who don't like the films of Angelopoulos hate the dialogue. Hate that it's just all this kind of musing and these characters kind of speaking these philosophical things out loud, etc., etc. And either you're annoyed by that, or it feels like a kind of invitation to you.
Yeah.
To kind of live within those ideas and swim around in them. Yeah. And I personally really enjoy that.
Yeah. I'm tempted to talk about dialogue in Samuel Beckett, but I feel like it's not that relevant.
Well, this was fun, my friend.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was good. The latest in the Page and Screen.
Although we didn't read Roadside Picnic, which we...
Yeah, well, yeah, you read Roadside Picnic
and
kind of in preparation for this, but I didn't. Yeah, so that would have been so before we end this, one more thing before we end this, I did want to bring up the fact that I never had any idea just how challenging the making of this film was. I never knew any of the details. Like I had heard in the past that, Stalker, this is a movie that almost killed Tarkovsky. And I always thought it was a figure of speech. Like it was just a pain in the ass, and maybe it was a long shoot or whatever. But there were so many, it's almost like it was cursed or something. There were so many things that went wrong with the making of Stalker that I wish somebody would write a book about the making of Stalker. I would love to see that. So if anybody watching this has any kind of avenue to get to some of these people who were involved with it, yeah, I would love to see that.
There's a YouTube video I can show you about the making of Stalker that might touch on that. Yeah. Although I think that's more about how Stalker killed Tarkovsky, because I think it was shot near like a nuclear reactor or something.
Well, yeah. Well, there was a factory downstream or something. Or upstream, and everybody was spending all their time sloshing around in the water. And in one of these footnotes in the book, he talks about how it was maybe the art director before he was fired, or one of the cinematographers before they were fired, because there were a lot of people fired from the production of this. Said that he personally attributed the exposure to those chemicals in the water to Tarkovsky later getting cancer and. But I think Tarkovsky died from lung cancer though, and he was a smoker, so I think that's probably actually what it was. But Tarkovsky's wife getting cancer and this, that, and the other thing, and yeah, I mean it was just the making of the film. I mean it makes the making of Apocalypse Now sound like like a fucking a walk in the park, a trip to fairyland or something. Yeah. So anyway, I just thought that was kind of incredible to read all those details. But anyway. Well, that'll wrap it up. Yeah. I suppose. Thank you for joining me, my friend, here on my channel. My first video in like a month or so, and we'll have to find another one of these to do for next year. Yeah. I think this is my third one. Yeah, we did the best intentions, and then I did the one on Rebecca with Juan, and then this one. And now Stalker. Yeah. So, if anyone watching this, if there's a booktuber watching this who would like to be a guest on one of these through Zoom, let me know, and we can toss around some ideas, and that might be fun. So we will leave it there. We're going to go see The Green Knight here shortly, my first trip to a cinema in, oh my god, 18 months or something, which is pretty crazy. You haven't been back, have you?
No.
Yeah, so this will be our first...
I considered going to see Black Widow, just for fun, but... No, I haven't. Yeah,
well, that's on. I think Disney put it on Disney Plus right away, much to Scarlett Johansson's chagrin. Yeah. Apparently, but yeah. Well, we will leave it there, and I will see you guys. I don't know about very soon, but I will see you guys before too terribly long. Adios. Bye.